The order of the event, we're going to spend the first hour hearing from our panelists. Each panelist will have about 7 minutes to present. I'm going to try to moderate time. So I'll put a little reminder in the chat box that you have 1 minute left, and I'll hold up one finger. Hopefully, that'll get communicated. If you go a little over, it's not the end of the world. We encourage speakers to paste any links or resources they might have on this topic in the chat box for our attendees. We can also send a recap email at the end of this. So we want to ensure there's a lot of information sharing happening today. So we don't want that to get lost at any point. And with that being said, I want to introduce our panelists. I've already introduced Sung-Hee Nam, faculty with the sociology department at CSUCI. We have Paul Stamper, the deputy executive officer with the County of Ventura. Matt Caprito from Berkshire Hathaway Home Services, California Properties. Amy Dugan, program manager for landlord engagement with the United Way of Ventura County. Maria Navarro, Ventura County policy advocate with Cause. Amelia Ramirez, housing director for the city of Oxnard. Clyde Reynolds, chairperson of Vulnerable Populations Housing Advocacy Network. Jeff Stinnant, an attorney. And then we have Ceci, who is a tenant and going to provide that perspective. With that being said, I will pass it over to Sung-Hee.
Thank you, Carolyn. And hello, everyone. Thanks so much for attending this very important and timely event. By the way, one thing that you would not want to do is to give a professor a podium, because she has an occupational disease of dominating the conversation. So I'll make my remark very brief. As you just heard from Carolyn's introduction, our panelists all come from very diverse backgrounds and viewpoints. But I know that they all volunteered to participate in this discussion because of their care for our community, especially for those who are vulnerable and disadvantaged. We all believe that in this great community like Ventura County, affordable housing for all to live a humane life with dignity should be provided. And that's where we all agree and converge. So my hope this afternoon is that we'll all listen very attentively with open mind. And hopefully this conversation will lead us and also help us work together to deal with these urgent community issues related to housing and eviction crisis. So since Carolyn already laid down the procedural matters, I'm going to just jump to our first panelist. I first will ask Paul Stamper to give us a background information about eviction moratorium and how the government is preparing for the end of the eviction moratorium. So Paul, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Sung-Hee. Again, I'm Paul Stamper with the County of Ventura. I work in our economic development area, and we focus on economic vitality for the whole community, and we have partners in our CEO office with community development and homeless services. And I just want to reiterate that our board and our CEO, Mike Powers, are just, this is the top of their priority list, you know, making sure everyone has a safe and healthy environment and place to be. And so our work in this area started long before the pandemic, but as you all know, a lot of work is happening, a lot of good work, but there's a lot more to be done, and certainly now more than ever. So I do, as Sung-Hee mentioned, want to just give you a little background on the eviction moratorium, the current guidelines that relate to it, and then talk some about our approaches that we've already started implementing and looking ahead to the end of that moratorium. So back on March 16th, the governor issued the first executive order that allowed local governments, counties and cities to implement eviction moratoriums, which typically they wouldn't have that ability on their own. Our County of Ventura, we implemented that on March 31st for both residential and commercial, and most of the cities did as well. So it's a type of situation where each individual jurisdiction has the option to do that or not. And on June 11th, the governor issued an executive order that extended that ability to have that protection in place through September 30th. And as we approached that, there was a lot of anxiety because there was no solution yet. And then, a midnight deal was done with the legislature in California. Urgency legislation was passed that went effective the next day, September 1st. And so the name of that was the Tenant, Homeowner, and Small Landlord Relief and Stabilization Act. It's a lot of words for one bill, but it did a lot of things. So that because it was legislation rather than an executive order, it allowed for that to be implemented statewide. Local ordinances did not have to be enacted in order for that to be in force. But it did just focus on residential, not commercial. The governor later issued an executive order related to commercial as well, but I'm going to focus here on the residential side of this act, which provides eviction relief, but it doesn't waive unpaid rent. So that's part of the challenge that we're up against here. So here are some of the qualities of this guidance and legislation. So the pay rent or quit notice was extended so that tenants could have, instead of 3 days, 15 days to respond to that. And with notice, landlords were now required to also provide a declaration of COVID-related financial distress form, which informed that tenant that they had the right to make use of that legislation. And if they declared a hardship, then avail themselves of those protections. So the legislation had two different time periods associated with unpaid rent. One is March 1st through August 31st, where a tenant could simply provide that signed declaration and they would be able to avail themselves of those protections. But then for the period September 1 through January 31, they needed to provide the signed declaration and 25% of the rent for that period. Now that didn't have to be on a monthly basis though, but it did have to all be 25% paid by January 31st. Then in February, those protections from evictions will still exist, based on the unpaid rent from previous months, but you must start paying your rent in full going forward from February. And then in March, what happens is that in addition to paying your normal rent, now you would also have to begin paying that back rent. And so that lasts for essentially 1 year. And then unpaid rent at that point, March of 2022, landlords would have the ability to make a claim for that, anything that was left unpaid, but they would do that through the small claims court. And it would be treated as consumer debt. Recent study by the Federal Reserve said that California, they anticipate by the end of the year, $1.7 billion in back rent will be out there. And as a nation, 7.2 billion. So it's not just happening here, and it's on everyone's radar. So some of the good news related to that is Governor Newsom, even before the pandemic, identified homeless as a crisis and one of his top priorities. Incidentally, just this week, the California Legislative Office identified a $26 billion in revenue that they're anticipating additional revenue in the next fiscal year, 21-22, based on revised budget estimates. So basically revenue beat expectations looking at this year and last year. So that's some of the good news that's out there. As a county, we've been engaged in homeless prevention and support and housing affordability issues for a while. Our economic vitality strategic plan, that's one of the cornerstones of that, the work that we're doing. And we continue to advocate with the state and federal government, part of our legislative platform, for resources to support that. But here's some of the things more recently where we couldn't just wait for this kind of eviction cliff to come up on us. And Project Room Key, where 4 local hotels were able to house at one time, I think over 450 people. We still have 160 people utilizing that. This is for fragile, over 65, even those with COVID that need a place to go. And at some point we were essential workers were also making use of that, where they wanted to protect their family and have somewhere else to go after their shift. Project Home Key, which is moving this into permanent housing. A hotel was identified in Oxnard with space for 70. About $10 million was used to, or is in the process to purchase that, and several million set aside from our board and CARES and other funding sources for operation of that. We had a rental assistance program with 5,400 renters that received 3 months worth of rent, $11.4 million in support for them. Farm worker rental assistance program with over 4,000 applications. We also had our business assistance grant program for businesses and nonprofits, and many landlords qualify for those and received awards, which, this crisis is not just for renters, it's also for the landlords who are struggling with the legislation that's passed and the pressure that it's putting on them. And so the state also has a tenant and landlord resources website, which I'd encourage people to take a look at. And for landlords in particular, there's mortgage forbearance options that it talks through on the website. And so I can see that my time's getting low. I think I'll just stop there and say thank you, everyone. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Paul. So I'm gonna next ask Matt Caprito how eviction moratorium is affecting the rental market and the landlords and property managing companies, and also what do they sort of predict after this eviction moratorium ends, what kind of a rental market they're forecasting. So Matt, please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, the rental market in the area in which I serve, mostly Western Ventura County, has already been impacted, even without COVID. Today, any rental that comes on the market it's it's quickly rented. I could get 40 to 50 calls in a couple of days on a given rental at this point in time. The impact, I have been impacted, so I manage a number of properties for individual clients. And I've had a few individuals that were impacted, COVID impacted. Some contacted me right away, some didn't know the process. And this process is so individualized. It's a matter of working with an individual one-on-one and to assess their needs to see what can be done. And so I've had a few on payment programs where they've caught up, and I have a couple right now that are behind again. I had another one negotiated where they paid their monthly rent with using their deposit. I just think it's incumbent upon landlords to take a deep breath, to assess the individual needs of a tenant, and to work with them one-on-one. You had some more to your question that I neglected. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so at the same time, would you sort of tell us a little bit more about, since you still have some more time, what do you predict after the eviction moratorium ends? What kind of a rental market are you expecting, and how does it affect the industry and also renters as well as landlords?
Well, I think the market is going to continue to be a challenge. I think the impact on the court system, the impact to individuals, I think that's the unknown that's out there. I don't know that if anything at all, having been a realtor here in the area for 30 years, the change that I've really noticed is more and more individuals want to come to an area like Ventura County and escape wherever they are LA-wise. That's generally true. The market is, the resale market is out of control with multiple offers on just about everything out there that's reasonably priced. And I say reasonably priced in Ventura County is probably under 700,000 or 800,000. It's a matter of days before properties are sold. And that's all the way across the marketplace. The rental market, it's still going to be a challenge. It will continue to be a challenge. I think the difficulty that we all face is the unknown of what is actually going to happen. My question is, what could we do before all of these cases hit the courts, overwhelm the system, and people are left out in the cold? And that to me seems like a problem that needs to be solved before we get to the end result of people not negotiating, of not finding a compromise. That to me is our biggest challenge. And I think everyone here will have a different answer to that. It's still an unknown as far as I'm concerned. Probably Mr. Stinnett, our attorney, he probably has a better idea. He has all the answers. So.
Well, we look forward to Jeff's presentation. But Matt, let me ask you one
Yes.
question. If you would like to suggest one thing that you think we as a community, whether from all different angles, we should try and do before that crisis comes to us, what would that one thing be?
At this point, I think the county has done a marvelous job with what it is, the resources that we have. If I could, wave my magic wand, I think that as court actions are filed, evictions are filed, that if some of those could be resolved, that would be optimal. If I could wave my magic wand, because at this point in time, we just don't know until we get to that end run, and because I think those are the people that are going to need the most help. There are people that are struggling now, but I think you're going to hit the wall with people that are going to be filed on, and it's going to be too little, too late. And that would be the hope. How's that? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that is why that is so unknown. I think for us to have this conversation, I believe is so meaningful and productive so that we can preemptively deal with some of these anticipating issues, right? So our next speaker is Amy Dugan from United Way of Ventura County. And I asked Amy to tell us a little bit about sort of the overview of housing issues after pandemic is over, which we all hope is sooner than later. So Amy?
I must unmute. Thank you very much. And I'm really thrilled to be a part of this very important community conversation, which is more critical than ever. Just a tiny bit of background on what our program at the United Way was started to do and accomplish. The landlord engagement program was born out of a gap in our homeless and housing system in terms of something specific to engage and incentivize landlords to help increase the number of housing units available for our most vulnerable neighbors experiencing homelessness, and those attached to case management and also housing vouchers and housing subsidies. And with that, we have been working with seniors, veterans, families with children, all of these households experiencing homelessness, and trying again to increase housing in a market that Matt is describing, which is very accurate, unbelievably competitive. And you take someone who has some barriers to housing and who is already vulnerable and in a state of trauma, and to get that individual or household housed it really takes a community. And so we've been working toward those efforts. I want to stress what Seung-hee mentioned in her opening, that housing is a human right. It is the solution to ending homelessness. It is what we need in this community. I'm excited to hear what Clyde will discuss in terms of innovation, what we need in terms of development and just creativity around how we can increase it. But the crises we're facing, the homelessness and the housing crisis existed pre-COVID, completely there. And right now, the COVID crisis has shown us a couple of things. One, that we can rally in a time of emergency, and that resources, much to which Paul, so beautifully articulated, become available, and that's terrific. And we need more, of course, and we need it ongoing. But again, these crises existed pre-COVID, and COVID has exposed and raised awareness and exacerbated these crises. And what we are going to see when the eviction moratoriums are lifted, no one can quite predict the volume, but it's not just going to be a wave, it is going to be a tidal wave. And we have not been able to manage our homelessness crisis pre-COVID, and the numbers are going to be staggering. It's, again, nobody can quite predict what we're going to see, but this influx is going to be daunting. And I think about it in terms of these housing displacements that will come, the housing insecurity. It's going to lead to more households doubling up. And doubling up during COVID is a recipe for disaster. We're going to then exacerbate our health crisis. And again, not everyone will be able to double up, and we're going to have this influx of newly homeless. Mercy House, for example, who runs our homeless shelters in Ventura and Oxnard, they have seen about a 40% increase of newly homeless in recent months. And again, this is before our eviction moratoriums have been lifted. So it is something that is going to take a lot of hard work and everyone involved. Just for scale, our 2020 point in time homeless count resulted in 1,700, this one I have to check, 1,743 homeless individuals, adults and children. That was 1,265 unsheltered, 478 sheltered, but by sheltered, I mean in a homeless shelter or some sort of transitional living environment. And typically that number is in actuality is tripled. So you take that, 1,700 individuals and you triple that, and that was in 2020. So it's we have our work cut out for us, and I'm hopeful that those households that are currently subsidized will be able to maintain their housing. But we're going to see maybe a change in the face of homelessness a little bit. And I think that's something to pay attention to. COVID has disproportionately impacted our Black and Latinx communities. And I think we're going to see that reflected in our flow of newly homeless, and there will be a disproportionate and disparate impact there as well. So everything we can do to mitigate, we need to. So I hope that paints a little bit of the very daunting picture.
Thank you, Amy. I think we've overused the word crisis. And what word do we use when it is crisis triple times, right? It is pretty, it's always scary, but on the other hand, we're here to talk about it. And I think I would like us to choose to be hopeful for dealing with these issues, as long as there's a human will, political will, community will. We'll just step one corner at a time, right? So the next speaker, I would like to ask Carolyn. When Carolyn first asked me to join this project, and I was quite surprised that she represents Performing Arts Center, and they are involved with our community issue of homelessness and eviction crisis. And I thought that how marvelous it is that. So I'd like to ask Carolyn to give us her vision and the vision of what kind of role she feels that community arts center should play in urgent issues like homelessness and also COVID crisis.
Thanks, Sung-hee. Yeah, it's interesting. Our location, we take up a 2-city block area. Beyond the theater, we have the community center. We abut Hobson Park East, which is a pretty expansive lot. And it's also just rife with, vagrants and encampments, and they sometimes manage to, climb over the fence, and they're inside our campus in the morning. And so really it's in our backyard. It's, these are our neighbors, really. And that's how I view it. I know their names. We're on a first name basis. And so, how can we be part of that solution, right? And working in Oxnard now 3-4 years, I see the interconnections between homelessness, vagrancy, and the arts. There's such an impetus to activate downtown, and downtown, has a significant homeless population. So how do you change that narrative? And the arts have been used as one way. I worked in the arts district in downtown Los Angeles, and really it was the arts and that creativity and the hipness that changed it. But at the same time, you have, Skid Row right there. And so there can be this harmonious coexistence between the two, where you can have economic development, you can have vibrancy, and it works. But that being said, when I think about the pending eviction crisis, I think about artists. They live on the verge anyways. My partner is an artist. So I know how this pandemic has hit working artists. He's a professor of arts up in Santa Barbara, but, even in that, in the vein of academia, they've been impacted too. And as a community center, as this anchor, this cultural anchor in the city of Oxnard, how can we respond to this? And I think having these conversations is one way. And in fact, Sung-hee, you did the homeless town hall at our venue last year. So this really kind of got my own wheels turning. And so much so that we had a conversation with Main Street Architects, Nick Deitch in Ventura, about what can we do with our aging facility? It needs some love, and it's ripe for opportunity. And he was the one who kind of suggested maybe some artist housing. And this has been identified in downtown specifically. There's a lot of focus on creating an arts hub. There's been funding set aside for it. And I was part of those survey and focus groups, working with artists and arts organizations in the city. Like, what if we're creating an arts hub, what does that look like? What do you need? And live workspace for artists is one of those things. And we have a great space for that. We can build up. We have parking lots. I mean, there's so many new architectural things that can lend itself to this. So that's kind of where we're coming at this conversation from. It's like, what exists in our community that we can leverage, that we can nourish, we can re-energize, reinvest in, and create something magnificent. Emilio from the city of Oxnard, I've chatted his brain about this. I think he got excited about it. So I'm just really honored to be here on this panel and bring that perspective of the arts and how that can drive the economy and be part of the solution.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn. I think, we need to work together, and also we should try different methods. And I am looking forward to Clyde's presentation about innovation and creativity. And we need to, again, try different methods and think outside the box. And it's, I think, what we really need. So our next speaker is Maria Navarro, and from CAUSE. And I would like Maria to give us a presentation about community organizing and advocacy for farm workers and low-income families, and how COVID is affecting these families. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you. Let me share my screen really quickly before. Okay. Yeah, so can you all see this? Hello? All right, so my name is Maria Navarro. I'm a policy advocate at CAUSE, and we're basically a grassroots organization here in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. We work on a variety of issues like immigrant rights, tenant issues and tenant rights. And, we understand that the housing crisis has escalated to a point where right now, like, the reality is that a lot of tenants are very vulnerable to eviction in the upcoming year, or in the upcoming 2 years, and even more, right, in the near future. So this is the lay of the land. So where are we right now? So the pandemic, like a lot of the other panelists have expressed and have also said beforehand, it has exposed basically two different crises. It's exposed the housing crisis in California that we were suffering in right now, and not only in California, but basically in the whole of the United States. The pandemic has exaggerated and put into a sort of overdrive what had been underlying issue of housing affordability in Oxnard, Ventura County as well. So we were asking, so what were Ventura County tenants dealing with before the pandemic? So we asked our most vulnerable tenants this question, and this is what we had. So we actually made a report called the Housing Crisis 805, which is what I'm going to try to share here. The Housing Crisis 805 report was conducted in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. 590 surveys of renters were done, and 185 of these surveys were in Oxnard. And now, obviously, we surveyed lower income and at-risk eviction tenants. So we surveyed people from South Oxnard mainly, and that's because that's where our base lives. That's where the people who we work with and who we try to represent live. The report also includes all the other data from reputable sources and government agencies. If y'all want a copy of this, I'll also link it on later. So this is a snapshot of Ventura County. Basically, the main thing I want to point out is that there is a 55% rent burden rate in the county compared to only 33% of homeowners. And even then, I think that 33% is still unacceptable for homeowners. 41% of the renters are Latino, while this number drops to 25% of homeowners that are Latino. And yeah, so what do we get out of this, right? That renters are, 1, they're low income, 2, they're Latino, and yet 3, they're most likely to live with children in Oxnard. and in Ventura County. This next slide shows kind of like the median one-bedroom apartment pricing since 2011. So if you see here, back in 2011, Oxnard is the yellow line, we had approximately one apartment bedroom would cost like around $1,200, and it skyrocketed to $1,800 now. What does this mean is that the median apartment price has grown a lot more than what our wages have been, right? So like the wage increase in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties in the last 5 years have only been 8%, whereas rents have increased 27%. And as of 2019, like the median wage for a domestic worker was $31,427, while the median wage for a farm worker was $27,083. So, low wages have really been, the heart of the housing crisis. And I think the importance of the living wage is more pronounced here, where people earn so little that they really cannot be self-sufficient unless they go into debt, unless they, borrow money, or unless they, live with other families. So they're forced to live together in homes which are honestly not equipped to house many different families. And subletting and subleasing, has become a common practice in Oxnard, and it contributes to like a number of evictions. And combined with the rising cost of rent, Oxnard's most vulnerable communities are evicted because of these issues. So what do tenants do when they have to deal with rent increases, right? They have to deal with, they kind of just take out money from necessities like food or health, and they're forced to try to do whatever they can with their budget to like try to accommodate for the rent increase. And this basically, is exacerbated by the COVID crisis. It's a lot worse. This report, by the way, I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but we've actually made it in December of 2019, months before the pandemic. So you can imagine that all these numbers have also increased, have become a lot worse with the pandemic. So a lot of these people, these tenants, once they, once the rent increase, they're forced either to move to another home, move to another city, or move in with another family. And like what was said before, this creates right now a very real health crisis with COVID. And it's exponentially dangerous to become homeless right now. And, in general, being evicted just hurts the community. It hurts the sense of connection that people feel with their own community, and children struggle with their education. And it creates just a broader negative impact on society. So these are some of the barriers that, tenants face when they're finding a rental. And the biggest one here that I kind of wanted to point out is the 34% with the credit check. So as mentioned earlier, AB 3088 would make, in a couple of years, all that back owed rent, what is it called, a consumer debt. So they actually so the landlords would be able to get that on a credit report for the tenant, can report that to a credit agency for the tenant. So if the most vulnerable population was already suffering from a bad credit report and was barrier for them to getting a lease, now imagine if with the whole new COVID crisis and all these bad reports coming in, how hard it will be for them in the future to be eligible to apply for a lease and to be able to get a rental. So that has been a big challenge as well. Oops. Yeah, so this slide shows that 50% of Oxnard renters in our survey had been evicted in the last 5 years, which is the second highest in all the 5 cities we surveyed, as well as 44% of Oxnard renters have been have had a $100 increase in the last 5 years. These are both high numbers, and and 44%, the over $100 increase, this has actually happened this year as well. With the whole pandemic going on, we've seen and we've heard of cases of people, calling us desperately saying that, my rent is being increased. What are we going to do? And so, yeah. And lastly, now this slide just shows that we have more empty homes than homeless population. And this is not really a surprise. We like to frame this problem sometimes with the housing crisis in California in general, that it's a matter of development, that it's a matter of like people not building homes. And it is a fallacy to think that, because there is enough homes for people. We just have this political question where the houses that are available are not accessible. So what do we do? I think, in cost things, that this is a political problem that we could be able to resolve. And now, who is most at risk, right? Oops. There you go. Who's most at risk? So women make up 63% of survey takers, but 74% of those reported being evicted in the last 5 years. Households made up 47% of the sample, but 64% of those who had been evicted, 5 or more people, right? And living with housing insecurity. So the biggest insecurity, what I want to highlight is this first bullet point. The biggest insecurity is for those tenants who receive a month-to-month like lease, right? They're usually the ones who are most open to get abuse from their landlords. And my boss's advice is like, never talk to your landlord on the phone, use text or email to get everything on record, because it does unfortunately happen that with no formal written lease, landlords can make up very ridiculous excuses to try to get a tenant evicted. And so what now? So, rental debt with AB 3088 is basically our hands are tied in the city level. The cities are not allowed to pass anything to consolidate debt, where you can't really do much in that front in the city or county level, right? And so we can put money like we did with the farm worker housing relief program to try to relieve a little bit of that debt crisis, and with that renter program that the city of Oxnard, and I think the county of Ventura was doing as well. But the problem is that money is limited, resources are limited in the city and county level. So the biggest thing that we as COS, like an organization, are saying is we need to address the underlying issue of rent control. I mean, we've talked about this for quite some time now, and it's just about time that this was implemented. If rent control is done, then I think it would alleviate a lot more these issues that our tenants are having. The city should provide know your rights info for everyone, especially at these times. What does AB 3088 mean? What rights do I have? Or can my tenant evict? I mean, can my landlord evict me with no cause, or all these issues going on? And we also are, trying to get legal aid for tenants facing eviction, because in small courts, I feel like there's going to be this disparity of power between tenants and landlords. Landlords usually have good legal teams, and tenants don't really have any. So it's providing legal aid in the county level or the city level to make sure that tenants are protected once these evictions start rolling out. But yeah, I think the one thing I do want to mention is that, we should think about this problem holistically. The problem has been here, like we've said, and I think we should address it like that. Like, it's been there's underlying issues to this problem, and COVID has just made them a lot worse.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Maria. That this is a very good arena to bring real specifics about. We all knew the situation, and I think seeing the numbers really put an added dosage of reality of how things are And thank you. So next speaker, Emilio Ramirez, is going to tell us a little bit more about the City of Oxnard approach and in a view of housing issues in the City of Oxnard.
Thank you, Sanjay. I appreciate it. And Carolyn for the invitation to participate. And for that matter, thank you for the idea to have this to begin with, especially coming from your perspective. I appreciate that. I don't know what more we can say than what was already been said. I think it's grim. I think it's going to be more grim in the coming future. I think that the impact on a person's ability to pay for their cost of living for the past 8 months and for the next year or more, it's going to be difficult. So what is the city doing? Honestly, a lot like what others have been doing. The county, we appreciate the county's efforts to provide rental assistance. We're going to do something similar. Our resources are a lot less. We didn't get those kinds of care funds, and hopefully there'll be a third stimulus package coming, and we'll be able to use them. But whatever we're going to do, and we are going to enact a fairly small rental assistance program, about $1 million, which will help some, but not nearly the need. And I think that that's something that we can get going. I do think, however, that we need to acknowledge that we're about to see a spike. We're about to see a spike in everything, in unemployment, in homelessness, in overcrowding, in condition of housing. I think that that's coming. I'm actually surprised it hasn't hit as little as it has so far. But I do think that it's coming, and that's based on COVID. If we were not in a pandemic, and it's difficult to imagine life without a pandemic at this point. But if we were not in a pandemic, we would still be in a crisis. We would still have an issue. And in my opinion, I think Maria, who just spoke, said it best. And Oxnard happens to be a coastal town, and therefore things are expensive in a coastal town. Housing is expensive, and etc. And maybe that's expected because it's a coastal town. The thing that is different in Oxnard versus other coastal towns, right, is that the wages here are so low, they don't keep up. So yes, we have a housing issue and a housing cost crisis that California or the entire coast of LA or Southern California is experiencing. It's not something necessarily that's special to Oxnard. But what is different is that the wages here specifically, as opposed to Ventura and Camarillo and etc., the wages in Oxnard are just lower. They simply are. And they're not, the people, the population here are simply not able to keep up. I mean, the median income in Oxnard is a lot lower than it is anywhere else. Here is $68,303. I can tell you right now that if we want to consider the affordable rental cost of that income, it's $1,991. Right now, the prevailing 2-bedroom rent in Oxnard is $2,340. How's that math going to work out to anybody? How does that possibly work? And that's a median household income. If you consider a person who is low income, who is a farm worker, who's making 60% of that, you think that the landlord's gonna say, "Oh, you're a farm worker, you're poor, we're gonna give you a break on your rent"? Let alone, how do they compete with the population that is making that income? They can't possibly compete, given that the rental vacancy rate in Oxnard is almost 3%. That means it goes on the market, it gets rented, right? And you're expecting a farm worker family that's earning 40, if they're lucky, $1,000 to compete with a family that's earning 68, who can't do it anyways. it's a difficult situation, especially considering that during COVID, you have a farm worker, and that farm worker is married, and her husband is a waiter at the restaurant, and the waiter got laid off, and now the mom is a farm worker by herself and trying to figure. I mean, it's ridiculous what's about to happen. Right now, the median household home price in Oxnard is $645,000. $645,000. That produces a monthly mortgage debt service of over $3,000. Yet the median income is $68,000. It just doesn't work. It can't possibly work. So what do? Can we do something that's quick? No. I mean, we don't have the resources to do that, and not to mention that we don't have the amount of money that it's going to take to be able to recover from COVID. But let's say that we're able to outlive that issue. At the end of the day, do we build more units, or are we gonna be able to build our way out of this scenario? I in my opinion, I'm not sure that this is the point that Maria was making, but if it is, I'm entirely on her side, and that is we have to develop wages. We need to develop wages. Okay, yes, we can build more units, and yes, we can build more affordable housing, and we can build more supply, but we need to develop wages. Somehow we need to develop our workforce. The kids that live here, get them to go to school, build more, whatever we got to do, we need to develop wages, because we're still a coastal town. I mean, let's face it, we're still a coastal town. We have people in Oxnard that are earning this much money, and you go to the beach and you're expecting to buy a $12 million house. It's not going to work. We got to work on the other end. I mean, during COVID, we're gonna run into a situation, and I think it's the terrible situation. I can tell you right now, in our shelter in Oxnard, right now, out of the 110 people that live there, right now, 32 of those people that live in our shelter in Oxnard are farm workers, full-time farm workers. They get up and they go in the morning and they pick fruit. I find it sad. I don't know what to tell you. It's going to be worse in a few months.
Thank you, Emilio. I say thank you for presenting it, Madhava. Thank you for the fact. This is one of those what we call wicked problems that there's so many different factors are intertwined to create this issue. So we cannot just do one thing. We need to all work together, right? But at the same time, Emilio, thank you for that point. It is a structural issue. It's not an individual issue, right? So there again, it just takes some political will to move the structure. So at the same time, you also need a very innovative approach. So Clyde, would you like to tell us what are some of your thoughts on this topic?
Well, I thought I would start by addressing the work of the Vulnerable Populations Housing Advocacy Network and why we came together and what we're trying to do. It's made up of a lot of the low-income housing development companies and individuals who are advocates for housing, specifically for the vulnerable populations. And I think, as we all have been talking about, that those individuals in our community who are the most impacted by this crisis are those who are very low-income individuals who live in our community. It's estimated that 71% of the extremely low-income individuals in our county are paying more than 50% of their rent. And so we know that when you look at the supply of housing, that the biggest area where we have a lack of supply is for individuals who can only afford very low-income housing. And if you look at the moderate and above, obviously we actually have an adequate supply. However, it's this area that needs the most focus. And so we came together to influence and create the public and political will in Ventura County to address the housing needs of vulnerable populations adequately and humanely. And that's obviously a broad goal. But we had to basically look at the fact that it's an issue of supply of appropriate housing, particularly the people we know are going to need very low income, subsidized rental apartments, rental units, multifamily units. And that's where the focus has to be. And there are two things that we identify that are problems. One is that we need to lower the cost of building very low income housing. We're now looking at costs anywhere from $400,000 to $600,000 a unit for affordable housing. It's unaffordable to build affordable housing. And so we have to look at that particular problem. So how do we reduce the cost of building housing? Secondly, it takes a long time to build this housing, an average of up to almost 3 years to get a project completed. So we need to shorten the time it takes. And so that led us to begin to think about what are some of the possible strategies and solutions. So as a result of that, we've actually focused on two areas. One is a group that we formed called Efficiency Housing Action Task Force. And this group is exploring and creating alternative efficiency housing development. That means looking at alternative models such as tiny homes, container housing, prefab, manufactured housing, those things that can be done quickly, delivered to site and assembled in a much quicker time at a much lower cost. One of the things we have a development team that's actually right now working with Emilio and his staff on a possible container housing demonstration project. So we have a development team made up of Mercy House, Quality Containers, which is a company that builds container units. We're still negotiating on the housing developer, and we're in the process of putting together a pro forma for Emilio, so we can look at what we are proposing. And at the same time, we have some assurances that the city is willing to look at donating some property for this project. And so that's one thing we're working on. We also are putting together a development team to work in the city of Ventura and looking at the possibilities of development of a tiny home community. So these are some alternative models that we're looking at. The other side of this is working with various jurisdictions. And so we have another task force. We're just calling it the Governmental Very Low Income Housing Advocacy Action Task Force. And we're looking for advocating for changes in local jurisdictions, building codes, ordinances, zoning, looking at development fees. What things can we do to incentivize the building of this type of housing and making it less time consuming as well as less expensive? We're also looking at, this is the time for us to look at the housing elements that are currently being updated in all of the cities in the county that are due at the end of October in 2021. And so we're examining those and looking at what kinds of strategies and information can we put into those reports that would create, again, incentives to creating this type of housing. So those are some of the things we're doing. I think I don't need to comment too much on the current situation because I think it's been well documented. But obviously it's very clear that since the COVID-19 pandemic, people are falling behind in their rent, and many will owe thousands of dollars once the moratorium is canceled. So I think I'd like to maybe just take this time to talk about an idea. How do you apply this concept of alternative housing models to the crisis? And so I'm going to talk about my $1 million idea for efficiency housing, a tiny home solution. We could create probably 20 units of tiny home in a tiny home community with approximately $1 million. And this is how we could do it. Obviously, we need the city of Oxnard to find us some land. The cost of land is a big part of the cost of housing that could house this project. We're looking at then a low-income housing developer who would actually develop this site like an RV park. That means bringing all the infrastructure to that, a road in, pads for the units, putting in the street parking areas, prepare the pads for the tiny homes, put in the electricity and the sewer lines, phone lines, cable to each of these, and then put in the landscaping that's needed, but then purchase and set up and license each tiny home. I've been in communications with an organization called Escape Tiny Homes, and this particular company is actually producing tiny homes, about 187 square units for $38,000. And they could literally deliver within 70 to 80 days, 20 units at a cost of $38,000 a unit. We could have those units purchased, delivered, they come on wheels, they set up and they're ready to live in, completely ready. They would have high efficiency air conditioning, heat pumps, stainless steel ranges, tall refrigerators, on-demand wall heaters, furnace, window covering upgrades that are dark out, blank out, full bath with shower, USB outlets, even smart TV outlets, a queen bed, storage closets, mirrors, all of this. And if you wanted to, you could actually put in solar. So I'll stop right there and we'll see where we go.
So a joke. The company didn't pay you for giving these commercials, right? I'm just joking.
Found it.
But thank you. Thank you for a specific suggestion. That's very exciting to entertain. And we'll talk about, how can we do it? We all know that we need different approaches. So last but not least, Jeff is patiently waiting. And again, we've been just hearing about this daunting volume of eviction cases. So I'd like Jeff to speak to us about legal ramifications of pandemic-related eviction cases.
Thank you for asking me to speak this evening. I appreciate being on this panel with everybody here. In listening to the responses thus far, I was kind of thinking about like in 2008 with the mortgage crisis. I'm kind of wondering if there's going to need to be something like that on a federal level that just goes to do workouts, because this has rippled into a huge problem. Not every landlord is a wealthy landlord. Some people have a mortgage and they're just able to get by, and it's rippled its way out. I don't know if it's going to be tax credits, workouts between landlords and tenants, which we're hoping to see when the emergency order becomes stops being in effect, the Tenant Relief Act. When the Tenant Relief Act goes away, assuming it does on January 31st and it's not extended, we're still going to be left what was put into effect by the legislature on January 1st, which is the Tenant Protection Act, and which we've kind of heard a little bit. Some people call it rent control, no fault evictions. And it does provide certain kinds of protections that try to deal with the conflicting interests between landlords and tenants, where a landlord couldn't just simply say, well, I don't want you here anymore. I'm giving you a 30 or 60-day notice and you're gone. Now, if they've been there for a year or more and the person falls under the act protections of the act, the landlord can't do that unless they failed to pay rent, committed a crime on the premises, or created a nuisance, unless the landlord wants to give some kind of relocation assistance. So it's going to go back to that, and that's two different components of the civil code that's going to govern that once the Tenant Relief Act, which we're under now with COVID-19, it goes back to that. I think that this is a public problem, meaning it's not just individual cases here and there like we oftentimes have. And I think you're just going to have some kind of interaction with the federal government to come in and just kind of do a global attack of the situation, giving some assistance to tenants, giving some kind of relief to banks because they're not getting mortgage payments from their landlords in some of these cases. So I think you're going to see that. I'm hoping at least. As far as I'm hopeful that landlords won't have to lose some of these tenants, because once things kind of get back into place, maybe these tenants can resume their work and the landlords can say, okay, let's just do a workout because it might be much more beneficial for them to do that as opposed to saying, well, I'm just going to evict you. So I'm hoping that that's going to be the case. As far as evictions go, it's going to be interesting to see how that rolls out, given the Tenant Relief Act, because as Paul was saying earlier, the tenants, once they're given a 15-day notice for failure to pay rent, once they can give a declaration under penalty of perjury saying I've been impacted by COVID-19. And once they do that, then the landlord could expect them to pay 25% of the rent. But as Paul had noted, they have until January 31st to do that. So the tenant in theory could give a lump sum payment of 25% on January 31st. Now you're left with what we're going to do with the 75%. How are we going to address that? And so, I'm advising clients, let's see what we can do to try to work things out so we don't have to do an eviction, because it's costly to do an eviction. And then there's an opportunity cost for the landlord, because now they got to hurry up and find a new tenant and everything else, which they might not have a problem doing, but they have to go through the unnecessary expense of evicting someone when they can maybe not do that by just doing a workout. So I think you're going to see just kind of an all-out front attack of how to try to resolve this issue, because it's not a good public policy matter just to have a wave of evictions and people just thrown out of their existing homes. That's just going to be a huge public problem that's going to be falling on everyone in the community. So there are certain kinds of rent protections that have come into place with the Tenant Relief Act that was enacted in January of this year, which caps rent increases at 5% or 5% plus the cost of inflation, but in either case not to exceed 10%. So that's going to provide some kind of protections. But back to Emilio's point, you want to be able to see what we can do to increase wages so that people can make sure they afford the rent that's due. There was already a big dynamic shift in January with this, Tenant Protection Act that came into place. And then when COVID hit, it now added another layer of complexity to the whole eviction, unlawful detainer, landlord-tenant issues. And so as that starts to eradicate with development of vaccines and people kind of getting back to work and trying to resume society as it was, there's still going to be the Tenant Protection Act, which is going to give some protections to tenants. And then, as time goes on, to Clyde's point, well, hopefully we can have a development that's going to provide more housing for people.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate your framing of your presentation, that it's not the opposition between tenants and landlords, but it's a public issue that we should all work together, right? And that I really appreciate that perspective. Now, our last speaker is Cecilia, and I know Maria sort of paved sort of a landscape of what it's like, amongst the low-income households in Oxnard. But Cecilia is going to be able to tell us from her own voice, what is it like personally living through this crisis and that sort of a pending crisis looming in their future. So Cecilia, thank you so much. I know you were working and you just came here, and really appreciate you taking this time to speak to us. So please go ahead.
Hola, muy buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Ceci. Bueno, Cecilia, yo soy trabajadora del campo. Yo trabajo aquí piscando fresa en un rancho de Oxnard.
In a ranch in Oxnard, and we work by the season, and so they don't pay us very much, but either way, we still work, even since the pandemic started. In March, our hours were reduced to avoid being contagious. I do not qualify for unemployment or for government help, and so it has been very hard for me and my family, since we don't earn what we normally earn during the regular picking season. Each year they increase my rent, and this year in June, we had an increase of $100. Before I used to pay $1,450. I'm now paying $1,550. We're paying much more in rent and we're not working full time, which has caused a lot of fear in my family that maybe we're going to get evicted if we're not able to pay the rent. We are afraid that the rent will continue to increase because, yes, if it increases even more, I'm going to have to borrow and I'm going to keep getting into debt. They raise the rent without justification. The apartment is the same. I've been here for 18 years and they haven't done any remodel. And for some reason, the rent continues to increase. They don't want to replace the doors in the rooms. There's a lot going on here in our area. We are the poorest in the south of Oxnard. So why is it that they keep increasing our rent? We are low income and low resources, while the rent increases more and more. If we were in LA, I know people who have moved from California to Idaho because the rent is too high. And we have seen that there's not a lot of workers in the field right now in Oxnard. And it's not because of immigration. That if that's not the reason why they're leaving, then it's because of the high cost of rent. There are no more farm workers, and the work in the fields is decreasing as well. When Ventura did the rent assistance plan, it was very hard for me to access that resource because they required that we gave an email address and where I live and the landlord, and he didn't want to give it. It's not easy to get information about these programs. I got this information because I'm in cause, but what about the other people? Not everybody has access to internet, radio, or sometimes they'll give us pamphlets at work, but many of us don't know how to read and they don't think about that. We also need a lot of support when we are filling out those forms because they'll ask us for email and internet connection. And the hardest thing is that there's no money for all of us that need help, especially when us essential workers, well, I decided to join cause because my rent was increasing too much and I didn't know about my rights as a renter. And here, little by little, I've heard about my renter rights, same as a farm worker. And now I'm a community leader in cause where I fight for my rights and for the rights of the folks in my community. This year, we joined the city council meetings to ask the council members to adopt rent control in our communities. Since there's no stable plan that protects the working families in Oxnard, I also organized some folks in my work so that they could give their commentary, and that's how it was. And we are not going to stop until there's a plan and they adopt a plan to establish rent control in our community. And so that's why also for all of you listening, I would love for you to join our committee so that together we can fight for our rights. You can contact your legislator or our community organizer, and that's Zulet Causa. You can send her a message, tell her your story. It's very important that we all keep fighting for our rights and that they stop increasing our rent. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for speaking on behalf of yourself as well as others whom you represent, and your voice is heard. And now we need to act as well, right? So I know we are way past our estimate time, but I would like to spend maybe 10, 15 minutes for panelists if you have a question to each other. And then after that, I'm going to move on to the questions from other participants. Any questions?
I don't have a question, but I do have just a comment about United Way's landlord engagement program and how just critically important it is within the community. This is a call to action to landlords that are out there to consider a population that is more vulnerable, to consider someone who isn't A+++, and there's such a need in our communities for housing, especially the most vulnerable populations. And I think it's just a critical time for landlords to wake up and consider this program. I think there's some obvious benefits. There are some incentives, and we've never had anything like this in our community. So I think it's an advantage to landlords. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just had a question to Mr. Reynolds. When you were describing about the needing to donating of land to get the kind of tiny homes going, have you identified, is there sufficient land to do these kinds of projects, do you think, or is not really? Or
well, I think given the experience we're having right here in the city of Oxnard, we're working with Emilio and his staff. We've reviewed sites, they've recommended some areas. Clearly there are sites available. They could house either the container housing project that we're looking at currently, or a project like this. And I think other jurisdictions would need to look at the fact that there are also lands that they have. I know in the city of Ventura, another group has worked to identify sites throughout the city of Ventura that could be available as for their specific housing element. And there are many parcels of land that are available. Now, the cost of those, if you have to purchase them, could be very expensive. Obviously, where they're owned by a governmental agency, and they're willing to make that their contribution towards the project, that then obviously cuts the cost of housing down significantly.
I have a question to Clyde too. So as you're, trying to implement these very innovative ideas, what would be the most sort of a strongest opposition barriers to implement those innovative ideas?
Well, I think there's always community opposition to most low-income housing. So, I mean, that's to be expected. However, I think if these projects are done professionally, they're done well, they improve the community, they're done aesthetically well, and they meet a need, I think we can make a good argument for that. And I think that's something that we've discussed before. For us, any project that we're doing, we're trying to demonstrate that it is possible to build more housing, do it quickly, and get it on the ground faster, and make it available to people. I mean, when you think about a project like I just talked about, $50,000 overall cost per unit, by the way, a person could actually buy that. If you look at the cost of financing that and paying for that. So someone could actually own that tiny home. So there's other models we've got to look at. It's interesting that these tiny homes are growing as a concept, not for the low income population, but for the general population are embracing it. So, and we know that housing has got to get smaller, and we've got to get used to not living in our little McMansions.
Thank you. My question is to Paul and Emilio. And how does the county and the city think of all these innovative ideas, and how much do you embrace this approach, outside of box approach and ideas? And also how, this eviction crisis, we all know it's looming and it's coming, and we know it's coming. It's going to be, Amy used the word tidal wave, and I'm wondering, could you share with us, what are some of the preparations that the county office and city office is taking in anticipation of that crisis moment?
Paul, you want to go?
Sure, I'll jump in first here. Thanks. As far as the first question, I think there is a welcoming of creative solutions. You know, there's an acknowledgement that we have a crisis, we need solutions, and you know, we can't meet the challenge by doing everything the same way that we have all this whole time. So, you know, I have seen some things already taking place, which is encouraging. I know in the past couple of years, our planning department actually worked with the farm worker community to develop farm worker housing plans that went through the development process and were approved and are free and available. Same idea, looking for ways to make it faster and cheaper for a potential developer to come in, you know, and provide that solution. And so I think we need to continue to engage those developers and figure out what are the things that the roadblocks, you know, how can we make it easier for them to do that so that it pencils out. And in some cases, the challenge might be around zoning, for example. And, you know, zoning is there for a good reason, right? You don't want to create new neighborhoods that are not close enough to the required infrastructure to make it, you know, efficient. And so it might require rethinking existing zoning. And at the time when you're in the middle of a crisis, that's not a bad time to have some leverage to consider or reconsider where some of those places might be. And somebody mentioned the idea of, you know, NIMBYism and resistance to that development. So that's a real thing as well. I know the city of Thousand Oaks recently had much development approved and basically made some changes to their zoning codes. And part of the reason that happened is that the local groups who are trying to promote affordable housing, many of those coming out of the Economic Vitality Strategic Planning Group, went to the board or to their city council and advocated for that. And so it's important that our boards and councils are hearing from all sides on those types of issues. I think the second part of your question was around what are some of the things that are being done or can be done. I think the one thing that the county has going for it is, both fortunately and unfortunately, we have experience already in recent years with disasters, right? We've been through the Thomas Fire together, the Hill Woolsey. We've also been through the borderline. And as a result of that, a lot of these community groups are already familiar with each other, used to working with each other, and understand the roles that they play and how they can, you know, be a piece of the puzzle and part of the solution. And so we found that we were able to leverage those relationships and do things more quickly and successfully when the COVID pandemic hit us than we would have been otherwise. And so we benefited from that. At the same time, you know, there's a monumental challenge with that. I know that our Ventura County Community Foundation had a year this year where they brought in $28 million, which is a big year for them. But many other nonprofits in our community are suffering, like the businesses right now, and are struggling to get the money they need to fulfill their mission. And so I think specifically as it relates to housing, keeping people housed and so forth, one of the main groups in our community that's doing good work is our Ventura County Continuum of Care Alliance. They have some very important programs that people should be aware that the Homeless Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Program. There's a Pathways to Home program, which can be contacted by just calling 211. I would encourage people to go to our vcrecovers.org website, and there is a link that has, you know, a much longer description of available resources as it relates to housing and many others, because a lot of times folks that are struggling in the housing area may need help with food, medical, and other expenses, and those resources can be found there as well.
you. Emilio?
Thank you. First of all, yeah, I love all those creative ideas. I think it's, I mean, let's bring them on. So I would love to talk about all of that. Obviously, there are challenges finding the right piece of land. It's expensive. We may have to buy it, and etc. I don't, in my opinion, in my career developing housing, it's mostly not about the cost or the process of constructing, but the process of getting it permitted. That is the long pole. And I think that we have to work together to try to mitigate that length of trying to get the entitlement and permitting done. So yeah, I would love to continue to talk about that and find a place for it to go. I don't know. I don't have a, I don't have a magic empty piece of land sitting around that I'm not using already. If I did, you would know about it already. But I don't think that we need to own it. I think we can somehow work to acquire it or another kind of function. I love the idea of innovative things, tiny homes, containers, all those things I think are great. I urge us to, number one, not sacrifice efficiency of development. What I mean by that is low-scale development as opposed to denser development that can provide more housing or something like that. The most efficient use of the land. I think that that's important. Also, I'm very against cheapening affordable housing. Okay, I don't want to. I'm not saying it has to be expensive, but I don't want to build cheap stuff. And so I think that it's important to us that the community matters, that the neighborhood matters, and for that matter, the person that's going to live in the unit matters. And we need to consider that despite that rental income that is going to be generated or the sales income that might be generated is not going to be at some level of a private market condition. It doesn't mean that the person that lives there or the person that lives next to it doesn't deserve to live in quality housing. And so if that means that it's going to be a little bit more expensive to build it, then so be it. I think it's worth it for the person that's going to have to live in that condition. All those things, I'm up for it. If that means my department has to subsidize it a little bit more, then so be it. Or if I have to issue a voucher, then so be it. Or if I have to, whatever. I'm not going to be easy, but if I have to go to council and ask for permission to do X, Y, Z, then I'll do that. But I'm not going to do that if that means, I want a waiver on this condition because I don't want to have to build this public park. I want to build a sidewalk in front of my house because it's just more expensive. I'm not willing to do those kinds of things. I'd rather spend more money and do it right. In terms of in addition to all of that, I would love to work on a project, something that maybe Carolyn mentioned at the beginning, but something that is not housing only, something that is involving a grander, more mixed function. Can we work on a project that somehow brings vocational school combined with a housing project? Can we build Oxnard College inside the community building on the ground floor with housing on top of it? Can we build a restaurant or a culinary school on the ground with a housing on top of it so that we can teach a person who might want to not be a farm worker anymore, but start their own restaurant business? How do we do that? Can we do those things? I think it's viable that we can do some of those things and produce another alternative for a person's livelihood. So I would love to work on those kinds of ideas. I do have an RFP that I'm working on right now. Eventually I'll issue it when I get around to it, and maybe you guys can help. In terms of working with everyone else, the county, everybody that Paul mentioned. I mean, I think it's one of the amazing benefits that I found when I came to work in Oxnard is that everybody gets along. You know, I said, Tara, I need a place to house a person. It's like immediate. Okay, let me start working on it. Or if I want to house a person, I have a Section 8 voucher, they're looking for an apartment, I need to pay someone's application fee, and I'll call Amy. And Amy doesn't even ask questions. She just immediately starts working on it. It's the most amazingest thing. So what can we do? I think that's exactly what needs to happen, is for us to continue to work on that kind of a partnership.
Thank you. Thanks, Tara. Of course, it's Amy. So
Gracias, Emilio.
That.
Claro que esperamos esto.
Okay. Now,
Muy
yes.
bien. Ahora,
Carolyn, would you please read one
Carolyn,
of the
¿puedes leer una de las preguntas que tenemos aquí?
Yes. Let's see. Carmen Ramirez had a great question. She says that she's concerned that funds might not be available to undocumented families. Do panelists have any information? And she encourages donations go to the 805 Undocu Fund, which I believe is through the Ventura County Community Foundation.
So anybody would like to comment on available resources for undocumented residents?
This is probably a question for the attorney. Number one, almost everything that we operate is done with public funds and for that matter, federal funds. And so there isn't a method to offer assistance to an undocumented person that we know about. Okay, I'll leave it at that. There isn't a method to offer a assistance to someone that we know about. However, the CARES Act has allowed for exceptions to that. And so during COVID, if you're providing rental assistance to CARES Act or from CARES Act or food share from CARES Act, there is not a requirement that's incorporated within CARES Act. So it doesn't impinge the public charge. It doesn't, those kinds of things are not the same as if it were in the regular CDBG round. In the CARES Act, it's a little bit different. But from my perspective, the Housing Authority, I cannot issue a Section 8 voucher. I can't do things like that for an undocumented person exclusively. I mean, we can do a mixed family, for example, but not for an undocumented person.
Thank you. Jeff, any comment on legal ramification of publicly funded resources going to undocumented residents at this crisis time? Okay. Well,
this
yes.
is Paul. If I can add just a few
Yes.
comments to that, yeah, Emilio's right on. And our county did notice that there was that option with CARES funding and has been taking full advantage of it. And so because of that, many of the programs that we've been able to offer are really targeted to that community. And so our farm worker resource program, for example, has really expanded their outreach. We have given, I think, over 1 million PPE masks and so forth. There's been numerous food share pop-ups, and we have what's called a backpack medicine team going out into the field, directly interacting and providing education and assistance. And so we've been trying to take full advantage of that and pay particular attention to our vulnerable communities.
Thank you. James is a champion, isn't he? Kelly, next question, please.
Sure. Angela asks, well, she comments that it's been said that we have a lot of empty homes and or buildings, and it's very expensive to build affordable housing. Is there a plan or organization that is looking into incentives to having those empty homes occupied, possibly renovating existing buildings to house more people and families?
Great question. I've been always wondering about that. Anybody would like to comment on that?
I'm not looking at that. I could tell you that.
I hadn't heard that before, so I'm very interested to know more about that. I do know another approach that we've been looking at is through our area agency on aging. They have a program where they try to partner, you know, where you find someone that can live and provide some level of assistance and get housing, you know, in a method that helps both parties. So.
Thank you.
Yes,
Right,
there, oh, sorry.
Go on, Amy, go ahead.
No, I was just to piggyback on what Paul just said, the home share program that you're discussing. We have far more need for people looking for rooms than those available, but a wonderful program and option. But Maria, I would be very interested as well to find out about the data, the research you did to come up with the uninhabited homes, please.
Yeah. It's actually in LA County too, as far as I know, it also has the same problem. There's like a lot more empty houses than there are like a homeless population. However, there is a group up north, I believe in the Bay Area, that's called Moms for Housing, that if you're all interested in looking at, they're the ones who actually made a big splash earlier last year, this year, I don't know, time is so weird with the pandemic. But yeah, they are working in actually occupying some of the empty houses. And just recently in NPR, there was actually another group that was interviewed. Oh my God, and I'm so sorry, I don't remember the name, but this is just not things that we organize here in Ventura County. But yeah, in Los Angeles, there's also another group who is working to get people back into these homes. And, you know, it usually has to do with like squatter rights and things like that. So it'd be cool if you want to look at it as well. It's a really interesting movement.
Thank you. Carolyn, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I mean, yeah, I definitely would like to look at it. I'm not sure. I don't even know how something like that could take place, but you know, if it's possible, I would love to take a look at it. There is a program, however, that I am reading about in Chicago, and it's kind of a form of foster care. So it's a host family program that Chicago does, where a social service program like the County Healthcare Agency, County Health Services Agency, would train a person to host a family, and then the housing authority funds the cost of hosting a family, like food and etc. And then that person, it can move into, say, a tiny home that gets built in the backyard of that house, right? So affordable housing provides for development, the housing authority provides for the cost of the host family, the county health care agency provides for the training of the host family, and that host family now is housing a separate family in a non-overcrowded scenario. That is something that I'm looking at right now, but the idea that Maria mentioned, I didn't even know that existed.
Thank you. Carolyn, I'm sorry, Clyde, go ahead.
I was going to say those ADU is now available to be put in various like cities in Ventura. And I know that container housing and tiny home applications would fit well into that kind of a situation, increasing the amount of housing. So that could be somehow linked to a home that's willing to add one and then use that for the purpose of that. That would be a good way to link that all together.
Thank you. Carolyn?
That dovetails into this next question. And Douglas Partello had a bunch of questions. I don't think we're going to get to them all today, but if any of the panelists want to take a stab at that offline, and he has put his email in the chat, he has some very pointed questions, so it'd be great to have those answered. But this one particular question, it's 3 parts. The state is making cities increase housing. How is that going for Oxnard and Ventura? That's question number 1. 2, would the allowance of 3 granny flats per parcel aid in meeting the numbers required? And are there any incentives for a property owner to build granny flats to meet the need for low cost rentals? So how is that mandate from the state going in terms of increased housing?
Well, I'd like to speak to part of that. From a realtor perspective, as soon as the ADU legislation was passed, cities came in, and some cities, even within Ventura County, came in and added overlays to the process, which made it really burdensome to even build an ADU. So the state legislature had to come in again and remove some of the barriers to make it a little bit easier. That being said, even if you could build an ADU, there is no specific special financing or incentive in any way to build an ADU, even if you wanted to right now. There's nothing out there that is accessible that would allow someone, even if they wanted to build, to do that. It will be part of the solution. ADUs are going to be part of it, but it's a very difficult. My father's home burned down in the Thomas fire, and I spent 2 years on an accelerated, over 2 years, rebuilding his home. And I have to tell you, I know people that are on their 3rd year right now. This is the accelerated process. So think about that when it comes to the terms of building an ADU. It's a cumbersome, difficult process to maneuver, and you have to be an expert and have experts. So I hope that helps.
Thank you.
So in Oxnard, so I assume the question is about the housing element and the required for building out the RENA allocation. We are in process of updating our housing element, submitting it by the deadline next year in October, and allocating the required units for the RENA. So we're in that process. That doesn't actually mean that actual development will occur anytime soon. Just will allow it for that process. Regarding ADU, I think what Matt just said, I think is accurate. We are looking at figuring out a way to not just permit or streamline the provision or the production of the ADUs, because we can make it be permissible, and then someone bring forth your own property and your own cash and do it if you want to, and that may produce some units. It may not. I don't know. But we're looking at possible ways to incentivize them doing it. For example, that ADU unit, that's repetitive, ADU unit, that unit, the additional unit is, in my opinion, Section 8able. And that Section 8 rental assistance can produce an ability to service debt. Therefore, should be able to produce an ability to produce the amount of money, the loan that it would take to build the ADU unit. Maybe not entirely, but at least partially. So we're looking at those kinds of things that might be able to incentivize. In addition, if that unit is not only Section 8able, but can be done in a way that I just talked about relative to the host family, and therefore for a homeless person, maybe my own sister that moves into my home, and I get assistance from the county healthcare agency or health services agency, so they can train me on how to provide support services to my homeless tenant, if you will, or my sister in this case, then I think it becomes a little bit more viable in making it happen. Clearly, from my perspective, I have a public purpose of affordable housing and et cetera. And that therein lies why I would subsidize something like that. But I do think something along those lines is possible.
Thank you. Amy, any comments on this?
I think just my gratitude for trying to think outside the box and these types of solutions that are multifaceted and then require multi-agency person involvement. I think that's critical to the success of any of this. So I guess just my hope and gratitude toward those types of efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Carolyn, go ahead.
One thing I was going to point out is that I know that the cost of building those can be sometimes very expensive. I talked to somebody who said the cost is just going out of the scope, off the end of the scale there. But here again, I know that Quality Containers has proposed that they have an ADU unit that they've created that's very inexpensive and could be immediately brought in, meet housing quality standards, and could cut that cost down significantly as well.
Thank you. So, Carolyn, would you like to close, or would you like to have one more question? It's all yours.
I don't know if we should have like final comments from all the panelists. We have about 6 minutes. There's one question from Heather that I think is really interesting, but that just sounds like it's another panel entirely, but I'll pose it just because I think it's a good one. She says, she says, thank you all so much for your input this evening. Would anyone be willing to further elaborate on the need to reformat from both ends, meaning the need for an increase of wages as well as restructuring of bank systems and participation?
Wow, she is my student, and I think right now she is producing an excellent research paper. So I can't wait to share her paper with you all. And she is going to be a mover and shaker in this conversation. I can just see it coming. So anybody want to sort of, that's a pretty humongous question, but you know, only students can ask those questions, you know? Anybody?
I'll wrap by saying repeating something that you've said so keenly through the process, and that is working together. You know, there's a solution here among this group. There are multiple solutions, and I'm thrilled to be part of this. And at the same time, we could agree on so much to further this process and make our community better. And I think that's awesome. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? If you can wield your magic wand, what would be that one thing that you want to suggest for us to try that gives us hope?
Well, I like the idea that, you know, this crisis creates an opportunity. And I think it's important that, you know, some of these ideas that we're talking about get tried. I think they're worth trying. I think no one of these is going to be the full solution, but they'll certainly meet and help to make the problem less. And so.
Thank you. Thank you. Jeff?
I think it's going to be kind of a little bit like with the New Deal. It's just going to take experimentation with legislation on different levels just to address public problems, and some things are going to work, some things are not going to work as effectively, but it's going to take bold action and during these kind of difficult times. Agreed.
Bold action. Why not? I think we, again, have to think outside the box and try new ideas. Maria, any last word?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. And it's been very inspiring and like very eye-opening to like listen to all these different perspectives from all of you. You know, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I'm going to say again, what can we do right now? Right now, we can do rent control. And I think that's one of the one of the biggest issues here. We can at least alleviate a little bit of what these people are going through, especially our high risk and low income tenants. And that's something that we're super behind up, and we would support a lot. So
Thank you. Cecilia, any last word that have not been spoken?
Sí, yo quisiera agradecerles por todo lo que están tratando de hacer. Sí, también decirles que nosotros como inquilinos no estamos pidiendo nada que nos regalen o que sea fácil, sino que podamos nosotros pagarlo, porque no solo tenemos para pagar la renta, no solo para eso estamos trabajando, sino que también para nuestros hijos, para nuestra comida, para todo lo que ocupamos. Entonces, yo sí les agradezco a nombre de todos los inquilinos, y pues que ojalá y sí se pueda hacer algo, por lo menos a que nosotros podamos pagar, porque pues sí es algo elevado el costo de las rentas. Y pues muchas gracias por todo lo que están haciendo. Ojalá y sí se haga algo para que nosotros podamos pagar algo que a nosotros nos ayude. Muchas gracias.
Wow, thank you, Cecilia. Thank you. Thank you. Amy?
I guess I would echo everything that's been said, but just a most humble and heartfelt plea to our landlord and property management community to prioritize our vulnerable neighbors and realize the obstacles they're facing and prioritize them, please.
But at the same time, I think it has to take a public rally.
Yes.
At this time, as you know, I think is again, we, many parties played a role in creating this issue, and it takes all of us, our personal and political community will, to move a needle a little bit. And also I'd like all our panelists and also participants, and for those of you whose question was not addressed, we'll try to send those questions to the panelists and convey the answers to the person who asked the questions. But to the panelists, I would like you to send Carolyn and me some of the resources that you think would be helpful for us to keep so that we can share with others as well. And I think this crisis, as Clyde says so well, that this is crisis and opportunity. And I think this is time for us to really see the silver lining. And sometimes we have to look very hard to find it. But I am confident when we have our focus on affordable housing for all, I think we'll be able to find one solution at a time. Carolyn?
Oh, I'm going to make a plug for artists. When we talk about thinking outside the box, there's no one better than the creative mind. And sometimes they can be difficult to work with. Again, I'm partnered with one, so I get it. But they bring a lot to the table. And so thank you so much for being here. And thank you for giving of your time and your talent and your expertise. We are really indebted to you and for everything you're doing.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good night, everybody.